US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has criticized China's response to the war. On Sunday, China's foreign ministry called on all sides to show restraint and end hostilities. Schumer, who is visiting China, told Beijing's top diplomat Wang Yi that Israel should be shown more support.
The ongoing events in Israel over the past few days are horrific. I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn these cowardly and vicious attacks. 250 young people gathered at a dance, and the Hamas terrorists took machine guns and shot them all dead. I was very disappointed, to be honest, by the foreign ministry statement that showed no sympathy or support for Israel during these tough, troubled times.
The Chinese diplomat Wang Kejiang met with the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh over the weekend in Qatar. It marked the first meeting between the Chinese and a Hamas official publicly being acknowledged by Beijing since the outbreak of war in Gaza. The Jerusalem Post, citing Hamas, has said that Haniyeh told the Chinese envoy that the war needs to end quickly. He also said that Israel must withdraw its forces from Gaza and also an independent Palestinian state should be established. And according to the report, Wang said that China was keen on relations with Hamas, which he called a part of the Palestinian national fabric.
China has a long history of supporting the establishment of a Palestinian state, with Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party of China, considering Israel an outpost of American imperialism. In 1965, a delegation from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, was received in Beijing with a state welcome rally of 10,000 people. A year later, China was the first non-Arab country to officially recognize May 15th as Nakba Day, in solidarity with the Palestinians who were forcibly expelled from their land and homes. China even armed the Palestinian Liberation Army prior to the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, due to its ideological stance of supporting revolutions and liberation movements.
The UNGA Resolution 3070 of 1973, I quote, reaffirms the legitimacy of the people's struggle for liberation from colonial and foreign domination and alien subjugation by all available means, including armed struggle, end of quote. This recognition is also reflected in international convention. Armed struggle in this context is distinguished from acts of terrorism. It is grounded in the international law.
Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism, a podcast dedicated to exploring past, present, and future real-world manifestations of socialism, by talking to those who studied extensively, lived in, or currently live in a socialist country. It's your host, Tony. And what you just heard was a series of clips giving a very brief summation of the revolutionary solidarity between China and Palestine, which we'll be exploring in this episode. This episode features Charles Xu of the Qiao Collective, which is a diaspora Chinese media collective challenging US aggression, which, among its other goals, is trying to be a bridge between the US left and China's rich, Marxist, anti-imperialist political work and thought in order to foster critical consideration of the role of China and socialism with Chinese characteristics in contemporary geopolitics. They have excellent articles and resources on their website, which I recommend that you all check out. We're going to be discussing Charles's recent article entitled The Gates of the Great Continent, Palestine, China, and the War for Humanity's Future, which I'll link below in the show notes. We're going to be talking about the origins and basis of this revolutionary solidarity between the people of China and Palestine, how this relationship has changed over the years, and China's stance today on Palestinian resistance, and how this revolutionary history manifests itself in the present. This episode was recorded in April 2024, almost 7 months since the start of the Al-Aqsa flood campaign, which began on October 7th, 2023. As of this point, over 34,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been murdered as a result of Israel's genocidal response, leaving nearly 80,000 people injured. While armed resistance continues in Gaza by Palestinian freedom fighters, global solidarity has also escalated. I humbly implore listeners to contribute to the various forms of solidarity in support of the Palestinian freedom struggle, whether that's direct action, financial contributions, encampments, education. If you find this episode useful, Charles and I did have an extended discussion on the state of China's support for other global South countries, which is accessible via the Patreon. Enjoy this episode, Free Palestine, and thank you. So I'm very happy and honored to welcome onto the show today, Charles Xu. Welcome.
Hi, Tony. Glad to be on the show.
So Charles, a big theme that has emerged doing the show over the years is the centrality and the vital concept and action of solidarity, specifically in a socialist context. So, for example, we've had Calla Walsh join the show a few times to talk about solidarity with Cuba and what that looks like for each and all of us. I've had Gerald Horn join the show to also talk about solidarity the Soviet Union, East Germany, and Cuba showed Southern Africa during its liberation struggles against apartheid in the 80s and 90s. So all this is to say that we're going to be continuing this theme today by examining the long history of solidarity between China and Palestine. And we're going to be viewing this history and present-day reality through the lens of your excellent article, which was published on Qiao Collective, entitled The Gates of the Great Continent, Palestine, China, and the War for Humanity's Future, which is an awesome title, and even more awesome article. So that'll be linked in the show notes for anyone to take a look at after this discussion. So to kind of get us started, let's begin with the present-day reality. What is China's stance today towards Palestinian resistance and liberation, especially in light of Israel's genocidal response to the Al-Aqsa flood campaign, which began on October the 7th, 2023?
Thanks, Tony. That's a great question. And it gets directly at, I think, a lot of the contradictions that I try to unfold in the article in terms of the historical development of the relationship between China and Palestine. There are many on the left today who, I think, understandably take issue with the formal rhetorical commitment that China maintains and has maintained since normalizing relations with Israel in 1992 to a two-state solution. And while I think there are legitimate grounds for critique there, we have to understand that the basis for that comes from an extremely different place and an extremely different set of historical commitments and present-day political commitments to those of the Western powers that, in fact, forced through the Oslo Accords, the historic capitulation of the Oslo Accords, and this mirage of the two-state solution, and whose continued support for Israeli settler colonialism, in fact, has undermined any realistic prospect of it. When it comes to the resistance in particular, there are occasional insinuations in the Western media that China continues to directly arm the Palestinian resistance. Much as we might wish that is true, there is not any convincing evidence of that aside from the obvious presence of third-party Chinese manufactured arms on the black market. However, at a diplomatic level, China very resolutely affirms the legitimacy of armed resistance to colonial occupation. Probably the most high-profile recent statement of this came from Ma Xinmin, who is a legal advisor to the Chinese Foreign Ministry and who represented China at a recent International Court of Justice hearing on the illegality of Israel's continued occupation of the territories that it invaded in 1967. To quote, Ma Xinmin at this hearing said that in pursuit of the right to self-determination, the Palestinian people's use of force to resist foreign oppression and complete the establishment of an independent state is an inalienable right well-founded in international law. And then he went on to cite specifically UN General Assembly Resolution 3070 of 1973, which was a historic codification of the victories of national liberation movements at the time, and which, as a binding statement of international law, reaffirms the legality of armed struggle in the course of anti-colonial resistance. China has also firmly refused to follow the Western Bloc, as well as some of its allies, including Japan, in designating Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other armed resistance formations as terrorist groups, and has refused to condemn the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood operation. To quote Ma Xinmin again, from the same hearing, he said that the struggle waged by peoples for their liberation and right to self-determination, including armed struggle against colonialism, occupation, aggression, and domination by foreign forces, should not be considered terrorist acts. And again, frame this in a very legalistic way, right? But it was a very, I think, telling political choice to reaffirm the legitimacy of armed struggle in that setting. And then in relation to Hamas specifically, the chairman of the Politburo of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, whose children and grandchildren were very recently martyred by Israel, he met prior to that on March 17th with a Chinese envoy named Wang Kejian, who, according to Hamas's readout from that meeting, confirmed that the Hamas movement is part of the Palestinian national fabric. So in that sense, while China's attitude toward the resistance today is maybe not as rhetorically bombastic as it would have been during the Mao period in the 60s and 70s, and no longer involves direct material provision of arms. Its diplomatic stance and its reading of international law are entirely in accordance with the legitimacy of continued armed struggle against Zionist settler colonialism.
It's just mind-numbing to me how terrible, say, for example, I'm in Canada, the position Canada's taken on the genocide in Gaza, the US, all Western countries, that China's stance is just refreshing. It provides optimism, I think, for an international solution to the war in Gaza. So thanks for that summary you provided. In researching for this episode, I wanted to kind of also get a sense of what everyday Chinese citizens thought about the specific conflict. And there's various articles about it, some of them trying to point, the average Chinese citizens' online postings as being anti-Semitic, others kind of, showing the wide spectrum that exists. So I just wanted to read this quote. It's from a Brookings Institute article. One can, of course, assume their own perspective that they'd have on the situation, but I'll just kind of read this out here quickly. It reads that widespread posts and discussions on Chinese social media showed a general lack of sympathy for Israel's security and territorial rights. The argument that China does not owe Israel any apologies or special support gained significant traction in response to Israeli expressions of disappointment over China's stance on the conflict. A video of Israeli ambassador referencing the Old Testament to assert Israel's right to its land was ridiculed, with some netizens sarcastically suggesting that according to this logic, China should then use the historical literature like the Shanhai Qing, or Classic of Mountains in the Sea, to claim the entire world. So I just thought that was an awesome kind of a reflection of what, or at least a sampling of Chinese perspectives on the genocide in Gaza currently and Israel's response. Knowing this present day reality diplomatically between China and Palestine, what lies at the core of this mutual solidarity, which has existed for quite some time between revolutionary China and Palestinian resistance?
Yeah, so there are a couple underlying factors to it, which date back really to the beginning of formal relations between China and Palestine in the form of the PLO. I think one of them is best articulated by Chairman Mao himself, who stated in 1965 to a visiting PLO delegation that, quote, "Imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and Formosa, that is Taiwan, are bases of imperialism in Asia. You are the gate of the great continent, and we are the rear. They created Israel for you and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same." We see here, of course, like a shared understanding of the Zionist entity as an outpost of Western imperialism that really underpins its domination and destabilization of all of West Asia. And in turn, given the key role that it plays in resource extraction from West Asia and in the sort of material fortification of imperialism, it therefore is of direct material consequence to the imperial designs of the West, and in particular the U.S., on East Asia as well, and sort of articulates an incipient sort of pan-Asian understanding, right, in a way that I sort of elaborate on further in the article. So that's one grounds for that longstanding relation of solidarity, right, is sharing a common enemy. But it goes deeper than that in many ways, especially at an emotional level. In this article that I relied on extensively for mine by Lillian Harris, entitled China's Relations with the PLO, which was published in 1977. She notes that, quote, "Despite great differences, the Palestinian arena is the Arab world situation which comes closest to fitting the Chinese experience of revolution against an imperialist invader." That's, of course, referring to the War of Resistance against Japan, which, at the time was fairly recent still in historical memory and remains obviously very much an emotional touchstone, particularly given the continued refusal of Japan to properly atone and the continued empowerment of Japanese ruling class in essentially unreconstructed form, from its fascist and militarist period by U.S. imperialism, enlisting it as a sub-imperial power in Asia. And so because that historical memory remains so relevant, I would say that, for ordinary Chinese people, right, for the netizens that you mentioned earlier, it remains probably the most emotionally resonant affective basis for solidarity with Palestine by ordinary people, and especially by China's, anti-imperialist left, both then and now. This remains the case even decades after official normalization with Israel, and you can see it, right, in post after post on Chinese social media that will put side by side images of the just appalling devastation of humanity, right, and of physical infrastructure in Gaza with very similar, very, extremely reminiscent images from the war of resistance against Japan. And so, in addition to that emotional resonance, again, as Harris points out in her article, it was the experience of guerrilla war, acquired by the Communist Party, both in the civil war against the nationalist Kuomintang, but even more relevantly, in their joint struggle against Japan. That was the source, the root of much of the concrete strategic advice that was given by China in the Mao period to the Palestinian resistance in the 60s and 70s.
One thing that has always surprised me about learning about these histories of solidarity, whether it's this one, whether it's between African Americans and people in the Soviet Union, for example, in the 20th century, it breaks kind of the presentation of history that we often get in regards to how different cultures or different countries interact with each other. That, say, for example, the 20th century, racism, as it is still today, was quite a huge structural impact on the entirety of the world, on the capitalist world system, to the point that one would assume that that was kind of the natural state of things for people from different groups to just constantly fight over some ethnic difference or cultural difference or religious difference. But looking at this history of socialist solidarity that existed in the 20th century, not only socialist solidarity, but just national liberation, anti-colonial solidarity as well, really just smashes that portrait of the past, which is incredibly incorrect, as you've just kind of given an example of us for.
Absolutely.
In your article, you heavily detailed China's material and ideological support for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or also known as the PLO, beginning in 1964. Can you give some of those highlights of what that looked like over time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some important context is actually offered by the evolution of Chinese diplomacy in the broader Arab region prior to the foundation of the PLO as well, because it's interesting putting it in comparison with that of the Soviet Union across the these decades. As is well known, the Soviets were fervent supporters of the creation of Israel, the partition of Palestine from the beginning, and you have this very interesting temporal conjuncture, right, of the partition being proposed in 1947, the Nakba occurring in 1948, and then the victory of the Chinese Revolution and the foundation of the People's Republic in 1949. And so amidst all of this, China, of course, began hewing quite closely to the Soviet line, although it should be noted that even though Israel unilaterally decided to recognize the PRC in 1950 and was by far the earliest state in the region to do so, China refused to reciprocate that recognition, wisely so. It wound up pretty quickly adopting an anti-Zionist line in the process of developing closer ties with many of the Arab nationalist and socialist states that replaced these reactionary Western-backed monarchies, most notably Egypt, and then followed soon after by Iraq and a number of others as well. So, this was in the process of cultivating and becoming one of the founding members of the broader non-aligned movement at the Bandung Conference in 1955. It should be noted that many of those relations were forged through the efforts of specifically Chinese Muslim envoys of different ethnicities, the Hui ethnicity and also Uyghurs and other Turkic nationalities within China. One of these who's really, I think, worth pointing out is Burhan Shahidi, who is the first governor of Xinjiang and who represented the People's Republic of China at a meeting of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity meeting, which took place in Gaza in 1961. This was something I only discovered after the article came out, and you can read more about it in this great article by Suleiman Hodali in Ebb magazine that came out about a month ago. But in any case, this essentially meant that once the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 1964 as sort of an organ for the Palestinian liberation struggle, which was, for the first time, essentially independent of direct control by any other Arab state, China was well placed to become the first non-Arab country to recognize it diplomatically. This occurred just a year after its founding in 1965, and this was notably almost a decade before the Arab League and the UN accepted the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So China was sort of well ahead of the curve there, and it was heavily acknowledged as such as well by leading figures of the early PLO, like its first chairman, Ahmed Shukeri, and then, of course, his famous successor, Yasser Arafat, who continued to lead it for another 3 or 4 decades, as well as figures like George Habash. who was the founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In fact, all of these different factions were on fairly good terms with China. It's worth noting that China sort of maintained these relations irrespective of ideological affinity. The PFLP was explicitly Marxist-Leninist. The DFLP, which was founded in 68 or 69, began as expressly Maoist, but China did not sort of preferentially support them in relation to Fatah, which was the leading faction of the movement, and which was at best sort of left nationalist, right, without any particular commitment to Marxism per se or to class struggle. Sort of China, recognized the necessity of a united front and continually encouraged cooperation by all factions involved, and both the political and military unity within the PLO. In military terms, China was also the sole arms supplier to the PLO among the great powers until around 1970. This was because the Soviet Union at the time was wary of disrupting its ties with Arab states, many of whom had prickly relations with the PLO at best. And also, while its relations with Israel were already by that time rapidly deteriorating, it did maintain them formally until the Six-Day War of 1967, when it cut off ties with Israel. In this sense, the intensity of Chinese material and diplomatic and ideological support to the Palestinian resistance was a way to distinguish itself from the Soviet Union in the midst of its increasing polemics against Soviet revisionism, as it called it, during the Sino-Soviet split. So these arms transfers were also virtually unconditional. Various figures in the PLO essentially expressed that gratitude for the no-strings-attached nature of the arms and training that they received. Their total volume did vary over time. They probably peaked between 1967, when a lot of attention shifted to the Palestinian resistance after the catastrophic defeat of Arab state armies against Israel. Between then and the Black September uprising in 1970. In the lead up to that uprising, which China sort of explicitly egged on in effort to, support the overthrow of the Jordanian monarchy by the PLO, it was really that 3-year period that saw the most rhetorical bombast and probably the highest volume of total arms transfers, right, to the PLO. All that said, after the defeat of Black September, what really happened was not so much like a sharp step change, more change of degree rather than kind in terms of the support that China offered to the Palestinian resistance. It started at that time reorienting towards Arab states. And this occurred sort of in conjunction with the completion in many ways of the Sino-Soviet split and China's simultaneous effort to seek alternative allies throughout the global south and among some Western countries as well, right? However, in diplomatic terms, this didn't really affect China's, resolute support for Palestinian independence in bodies like the UN, which, the People's Republic entered, to great celebration from the global south in 1971, replacing the representatives of the, Chiang Kai-shek Kuomintang regime in Taiwan. And, one of its first acts after joining the UN was to basically be the only member of the Security Council that refused to vote for Resolution 338, which ended the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And it also boycotted the Geneva Peace Conference following that. Both of those on the grounds that the negotiations that were proposed between Israel, Egypt, and Syria to bring that war to an end did not recognize the national rights of the Palestinian people, whether that be their right to an independent state and their homeland or the right of return to the territories that had been stolen in 1948. So basically throughout this period of what I call the high tide of national liberation, China's support for the Palestinian armed resistance, both rhetorically and materially, was pretty steadfast and really set it apart from other major powers in both the capitalist and the socialist camps.
I wanted to add on to what you said there. I did want to read quotes from your article itself, where you quote different leaders of Palestinian resistance, specifying and pointing out China's incredible role in supporting and standing with the Palestinian resistance movement. So the first one here is from Ahmed Shakiri, who is that first chairman of the PLO. He said that Palestinians should feel grateful not to other Arabs, but to the gallant and generous Chinese people who helped our revolution movement long before the Arab heads recognized the PLO. It is not, as some seem to think, propped up by Nasser or any other Arab leader. Yasser Arafat would state that China was the biggest influence in supporting our revolution and strengthening its perseverance. And George Habash, who's the founder of the PFLP, or the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, stated that our best friend is China. China wants Israel erased from the map because as long as Israel exists, they'll remain an aggressive imperialist outpost on Arab soil. So, just hearing from those three very key leaders in Palestinian resistance speak to China's solidarity is just absolutely fascinating, because it's not, when I think of Palestinian resistance, prior to reading your article, prior to learning more about this history, I never would have assumed that China played such a significant role. Is it something that you see in any media today where they talk about specifically this history, or would it be more like, say, for example, Western media? Is it ever really mentioned at all, this history?
Yeah, I can't say in sort of mainstream Western media that this history going back to the Mao period comes up that often. We know that a lot of this coverage is deeply ahistorical to begin with, right? And displays a very intentional and calculated amnesia, such that, for example, China's these days predominantly diplomatic support for the cause of Palestinian liberation, couched in language that is certainly more moderate than that of the Mao period. But nonetheless, coming from a place of deep-seated ideological conviction, right? It's often portrayed in Western media as though it's just like kind of an opportunistic attempt to hop on like an anti-Western bandwagon, right? To like rhetorically attach itself to, the Palestinian cause, because genocide in Gaza right now, has so historically discredited Israel, not just within the global South, but among large fractions, I would say majorities of most of the populations within the West as well, right? Within Western media, like captured as they are by corporate and therefore imperialist and Zionist interests, there's no intimation, right, that any state putting its weight behind the Palestinian cause, whether rhetorically or materially or otherwise, is doing so out of anything other than just naked self-interest. Just look at the way that they're talking about Iran, right? Which, just yesterday, as of the time of recording, launched, a historic direct attack against Israel on its own territory, which, of course, came in direct retaliation to an Israeli attack on, an Iranian facility, right? But which very much was an act also taken in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance and as part of the broader axis of resistance. The way that even that like quite overt act of material solidarity is portrayed is one that completely negates deep-seated ideological commitment of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the cause of Palestinian liberation and, historically to so many other anti-colonial struggles worldwide, right? And the same is just as true, if not more so, in how they treat these statements from China as a state, and also the sentiments of Chinese people, right, as articulated, on these social media posts that China watchers love to, distort through whatever their favorite narrative is, right? Whether that, this is just what the censors want us to see, or what the censors will allow, or it's an expression of rampant anti-Semitism on the Chinese internet, right? Like all these narratives are calculated so as to essentially erase this history, because to acknowledge it is dangerous for the coherence and whatever remaining shreds of credibility this media narrative holds over its intended audience. Because, it serves their interests to present China or Russia or even Iran, for instance, as rival, quote unquote, imperialist powers to the US that are only looking out for their narrow interests and for regional hegemony and so on and so forth, right? What's really unfortunate is that there are large segments of the self-described broader Western left and the broader sort of Palestinian solidarity movement who do not have a strong anti-imperialist analysis and who buy into those narratives as well. In many ways, Qiao Collective itself formed not just to challenge, these anti-China narratives in the sort of the mainstream, but specifically to, counter such narratives within the left as well. And so that's really where I would situate the intervention that I'm trying to make in this article in terms of the discourse that we see on the left, right? And to show that for all the twists and turns of the specificities of the Chinese line on Palestine over the course of the decade, which tandem with obviously major geopolitical and economic shifts in the world system, there has been a consistent through line of genuine anti-imperialist commitment and, ideological and affective solidarity with the Palestinian people that has remained undimmed.
I've just realized something as you were speaking. So first, one, I could imagine news articles in the 60s being like the China-backed Palestinian militants or whatever, articles to that effect, kind of mimicking this Iran-backed, Iran-backed militants in wherever in the Middle East, right? That this kind of phraseology of Russia-backed, China-backed, whatever it is, Iran-backed, really obscures the reality of the deep-seated solidarity, essentially. As you mentioned, it's kind of like a way to erase it, to pretend that it doesn't exist, and it's more of a state looking out for itself with some alternative motive, rather than an actual genuine solidarity, which, trying to present it as if no one would actually be in solidarity with this unless they were, the bad guys or whatever.
That's exactly right. It's a way to delegitimize, first of all, the resistance itself by painting it as something that is not, authentically and organically rooted in the Palestinian people, which of course it always has been, and rather as a foreign proxy, right? Impose, whether by the machinations of China in the 60s and 70s or Iran today, right? And yeah, it's part of a broader project to discredit and delegitimize the resistance, in the eyes not just of broad, like depoliticized masses of people who consume mainstream media exclusively, right? But even of those segments of the particular sort of like Western, quote unquote, Palestinian solidarity movement that will only engage with those kinds of defanged and NGOized elements of so-called Palestinian civil society that were allowed to become the main Western-facing interlocutors of the Palestinian people in the wake of the Oslo Accords and of normalization with Israel. And it's a way to distinguish those voices, right, which have been carefully cultivated by the West, as and by Israel itself, right, as part of its project of installing, its own neo-colonial comprador proxies to rule over Palestinians. Yeah, to basically elevate them, right, as the only legitimate spokespeople for the Palestinian cause, and to dissociate them from the armed resistance that has proven time and again, and most emphatically, I would say, on October 7th, and in the wake of it, in these 6 months of brutal genocidal war that have nonetheless absolutely failed to achieve any of their military objectives against the resistance in Gaza. They have proven themselves to be actually the only force, standing between the Palestinian masses as a whole and the naked genocidal brutality of the Zionist entity. And I think a lot of people are waking up to this now, which is a very positive development, and one that it's really unfortunate that it's taken, such an immense human toll for much of the movement to see, right? And my hope would certainly be that understanding of the legitimacy and the necessity of armed resistance in this anti-colonial context would extend then to a broader anti-imperialist understanding that acknowledges the necessity of creating, a broader, as Samidun puts it, international popular cradle for the resistance that includes the crucial interventions of powerful states like Iran, Russia, and China as sort of material bulwarks for the continued survival and the continued military victories, really, of the Palestinian resistance.
So you've walked us through China's stance today, and you've also taken us back to the 60s and the support for the PLO. In between those time periods, between the 60s and China's response or perspective today, the diplomatic stance today, in the interim period, how have the contradictions, the material realities, geopolitical conditions of China's development shaped China's stance of solidarity through this time period, for better or worse? For example, the Great Cultural Revolution or the Reform and Opening Up period. How did those impact China's shifting stances and solidarity and support for Palestinian resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question, because To be honest, a lot of the historiography of this period of wrenching transformations in Chinese history really has a sort of tunnel vision, right? Where they're looking just at internal political dynamics within China and not really understanding that those progressed in a necessary dialectical relation with broader geopolitical shifts in the world system, in the sort of unfolding of the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. And this is definitely a major fault within the Western historiography, and to be quite honest, a lot of the mainstream or official Chinese historiography as well, right? So, I think your question gets at the heart of how we have to actually take a global view of these transformations. Specifically speaking to the Cultural Revolution, it took place from 1966 to 76. It pretty much almost exactly coincided with this period of most fervent Chinese support, not just for Palestinian liberation struggle, but national liberation struggles worldwide, right? And it has to be admitted that this represented sort of a confluence of several factors, because the Cultural Revolution coincided with the height of China's quote-unquote anti-revisionist polemics against the USSR. And this meant that it had an additional incentive going beyond the genuine anti-imperialist commitments that it shared with these liberation movements to try to outflank the Soviet Union in terms of its the intensity of its commitment to the Palestinian liberation struggle. It's true that even though it didn't condition its support for the PLO or for any of its factions on, say, cutting off ties with the USSR, China itself did use its sort of very effusive support for their liberation struggle as a rhetorical cudgel against the Soviets. There was even a point when the Soviet Union had essentially been strong-armed by the West into lifting restrictions on the emigration of Soviet Jews to Palestine, where China accused the Soviets of thereby materially supporting the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. This was a sort of interesting tidbit that I discovered in my research. However, this kind of intense anti-Soviet stance did, as we know well, lay the seeds for the rapprochement with the United States and with other Western powers. And this was a realignment that was basically started in the late 60s and early 70s, most notably with Nixon's visit to Beijing, right? And it was a realignment and a contradiction with militant third worldism that was very much already underway by the last years of the Mao era. Not something that just all of a sudden remarked a complete 180 right after Mao's death. It was already a process that was unfolding. Simultaneously with those geopolitical developments, you had the recession of the high tide of national liberation struggle globally. And then regionally within Palestine and the surrounding areas, the PLO basically lost one regional ally after another to normalization with Israel. This, of course, began with Egypt, which established relations with Israel in 1979, coincidentally the same year that the PRC normalized relations with the US. And, in addition to its loss of strategic depth in the region in terms of neighboring Arab countries kind of abandoning their commitment to Arab nationalism, to pan-Arabism, and to militant support of the Palestinian cause, the PLO also suffered grievous direct military setbacks, right? Particularly in the Lebanese Civil War, when it was, it had already been forced to abandon its bases in Jordan and relocate to Lebanon in 1970 after Black September. And then it was forced into exile from Lebanon because of the Israeli invasion and the siege of Beirut in 1982. And much of it wound up in exile in Tunisia, some of it Yemen, right? And the leadership thereby wound up being very much divorced from realities on the ground in Palestine, particularly, during the first Intifada, which began in 1987. This led to a situation where the PLO, which by this time was very much entrenched as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, in global bodies, right, and certainly in diplomatic terms, wound up entering into negotiations with Israel, right, direct negotiations, starting in 1991, culminating with the Oslo Accords in 1993, where they, essentially unilaterally abandoned historic claims to 78% of Palestine and, recognized Israel in a way that was very much unreciprocated. What they got in return, of course, was this arrangement where they were installed as a collaborationist counterinsurgent force over the West Bank and Gaza, and the vague promise of a two-state solution somewhere down the line. The thing was that during that period, from 91 to 93, you had, again, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people normalizing with Israel, and that basically gave cover for many of its allies, particularly socialist and ex-socialist ones, like China, like Vietnam, but also including virtually all of the Eastern Bloc countries, right, and the former Soviet republics, all normalizing with Israel as well. The fact that this coincided with the fall of Soviet Union and of socialism throughout the Eastern Bloc in general was not coincidental either. So you had those global dynamics, and then of course reform and opening on the economic side involved the active promotion of foreign investment in certain sectors and the development of trade ties pretty much indiscriminately with whoever would do business with China. And this included Israel actually years in advance of the establishment of formal diplomatic relations, particularly as a conduit for Western arms technology, which even during the honeymoon period, the US and its allies were pretty wary to share with China. And then after 1989, right, the Tiananmen protests, they imposed a complete arms sanction on China, right? So you had that dynamic as well that was militating towards a heightening of both political and economic ties between China and Israel. That, of course, is not the end of the story, right? Because as a result of its very sort of calculated opening to foreign investment, its incorporation of that into a broader developmental strategy that has carefully preserved China's sovereign developmental model, both in political and economic terms. You now have China rising to become, at this point, a major rival to the United States in, virtually all technological sectors, the second, or, by some measures, the first largest economy in the world. And as a result of that, you, of course, have this renewed Cold War offensive on all fronts, military, economic, ideological, directed from the U.S. and the Western camp against China. And what we're seeing now, especially since October 7th, is Israel being increasingly entrenched solely in this diminishing camp of its Western allies, with literally almost nobody else in the world on their side. Therefore, because of that increasing identification and because of this increasing polarization, right, between the West and China, I think this will inevitably, one way or the other, possibly at a more gradual pace than people are happy with, but in a pretty ineluctable way, it will swing the pendulum back in the other direction. We're already seeing it in many ways with the kind of rhetorical and diplomatic firepower that China has brought to the table. And I wouldn't be surprised if that translated as well into quite public material repercussions as well in terms of Chinese trade with Israel. We've already seen some indications. China has readily complied with Ansar Allah's blockade of Israel-bound trade in the Red Sea. There are many reports in Israeli media about de facto, sanctions being imposed by Chinese suppliers on the Israeli high-tech sector. And all of this has been pretty quiet so far because that's how China operates. But at some point, it, just like the rest of the South, I think will be forced by circumstances to choose. And all of these developments, that have led up to the current moment are making that choice quite glaringly obvious.
I don't think I'll never not find the Sino-Soviet split just infuriating. Even though I totally understand the contradictions at play, the material realities, it's still something that always gets me. For people who want to learn more specifically kind of about the split itself, I did do a series of episodes with Carlos Martinez, who's written an excellent book on Chinese socialism in general, which is called The East is Still Red, I believe. We cover the Sino-Soviet split, what Chinese socialism looks like today, among many other topics. But kind of getting back to our discussion here, the 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union and China's rapprochement with the West led to the total unraveling of many progressive movements around the world, national liberation struggles. For example, on the show, we've had Gerald Horne come on to talk about the Soviet and communist support for Southern African movements against apartheid. And though they're incredibly successful in breaking the back of apartheid through military support throughout the 80s, by the time 1990 came around and things were not looking good for the apartheid regime, the Soviet Union was also in massive decline, or actually already broken apart by that point. So that left Southern Africa in a position where they now had to capitulate to the demands of the West in terms of developing their now essentially liberated country from apartheid. But much of South Africa's issues today stem from this fact that it was essentially an incomplete revolution because of this chaos caused by the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think we see something similar here with what you mentioned in regards to the way the Oslo Accords played out in the early 90s.
Yeah, exactly.
So kind of given this history of solidarity today, what are the material and ideological connections to Palestinian resistance, say, for example, in strategy and tactic? Is there anything that, say, for example, Mao's guerrilla, tactics, do those come into play at all today? Are they still relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I pointed out in my article, and I devote sort of a whole section of it to precisely this phenomenon, is that the influence of Mao's writings on guerrilla strategy and tactics, they have this almost timeless character to them, and one that not entirely, but in large part, is independent of like the precise political or ideological character of the guerrilla movement in question. So for that reason, I think their influence has actually long outlived the transition largely from Marxism and left nationalism as embodied in formations like Fatah and the PFLP to political Islam, right, as embodied by, for example, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as the leading force within the Palestinian armed resistance. And something that I did not discover in time to put it in the article, but almost immediately afterwards, and I was sort of kicking myself for not having discovered this before writing the article, was that, this transition actually, it was really interesting because in some ways the Maoist precept of the mass line itself played a crucial role in that transition. There's this fascinating article by Manfred Singh called Brothers in Arms, How Palestinian Maoists Turned Jihadists. It came out in 2011, I think. It basically talks about how within Fatah, even at a time when the sort of mainstream of that movement was increasingly taking on like a militarily defeatist posture and sliding towards some sort of accommodation with Israel after the successive defeats that I mentioned earlier. There was sort of a minority tendency within Fatah that sort of hewed to Maoism, both in terms of armed struggle and in terms of overall political practice. But very interestingly, again, in this period globally of sort of receding like national liberation struggles, right, of global reaction and counter-revolution and the strengthening of neo-colonial dominance, even over like newly independent countries in the global south, you had many of these Maoists within Fatah who took this idea of the mass line seriously, the mass line being this practice of going to the masses and engaging with them in an exchange of their sort of concrete lived experiences with your sort of theoretical framework as a result of being trained and politically developed within a cadre organization, and then iteratively developing with the masses a strategy for liberation grounded in their material realities, involving them, really shaping them into an active protagonist and a vehicle for their own liberation, right? That's the idea of the mass line. It comes directly from Mao and from the political practice of the Communist Party, in course of the liberation struggle. You had these Maoists within Fatah who applied this within their own societies and came to the very interesting conclusion that, in fact, Marxism itself was not grabbing people the way that it used to, and that they had perhaps been too dismissive of the really outsized role that Islam plays in the social realities of the region, in people's everyday lives, and in particular as like a tool for political mobilization behind armed resistance. So you had this figure, Munir Shafiq, who began as part of this Fatah left wing, began with Maoist commitments, and then went on in the early to mid 80s to become a founder of the Islamic Jihad Brigades, which was kind of a precursor to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And he wrote in a passage that's quoted in this article, "For years, we have searched for the mass line while it lay directly before our eyes, but we did not see it. Do you not see that Islam is the line of the masses in our countries? So by what logic do we look for characteristics of the revolution by saying that they're national democratic or socialist while they're Islamic here, if we like it or not?" And that I found to be quite interesting because a common narrative in the left is that Palestinian resistance kind of like lost its progressive character, right? And became like taken over by Islamism. And even, many people who I think continue to stand in quite unconditional solidarity with it naturally assume that it was like different groups of people who came to the fore, that, there was not a lot of overlap in personnel, so to speak, between the militants of Hamas and PIJ versus those of the PFLP and other left-wing forces earlier. But this was a very interesting indication of, in fact, the role of Maoist political practice in actually many of the same people, right, undergoing that transition as they saw the original mainstream of the liberation movement moving away from armed struggle as a tactic, and so finding in many ways a more hospitable political home within this burgeoning movement of political Islam, and thereby, helping it attain a sort of quasi-hegemony within the armed resistance movement. That's like all a very, I guess, interesting aside to what I was talking about specifically in the article, which was the specificity of the military tactic. And there, I sort of concentrated on three particular dimensions of Mao's thought on guerrilla war and their specific relations to the Palestinian armed resistance and, their sort of like regional context as well. So to go over those quickly, the first was, so I guess this whole analysis was very much grounded in the sort of framework that comrades in the Palestinian youth movement have given for how to understand Gaza, right? As more than simply an open-air concentration camp or death camp, which of course is, overwhelmingly how it has come to the awareness of the broader Western solidarity movement, right? In many ways, because I think large swaths of that movement continue to be able to relate on some level more easily to the figure of the Palestinian as a victim than as, active agent in their own liberation. But there are all these other ways in which Gaza has been significant as well, which PYM really centers in their analysis. One is as the popular cradle for the resistance. Another is as a de facto liberated territory, albeit one still under siege, from basically 2006 until now, when Israel at the time withdrew its settlers, withdrew its forces, placed the Strip under siege, but created conditions that allowed for Hamas and the armed resistance more generally to actually, attain governing authority over a large swath of Palestinian territory and convert it into a base to develop an indigenous arms industry and to mount periodic resistance operations into quote unquote Israeli territory itself, of which October 7th represented the most spectacular culmination. And then the last way to characterize Gaza in this respect is as the focal point of the axis of resistance. In many ways, what I did for this article was I thought about those three specific features of Gaza, right, as popular cradle, as liberated territory, and as the center of the axis. And I started thinking about elements of Mao's writings on guerrilla war that related to them. So in the case of popular cradle, which sort of informally speaking is this idea that has been cultivated within Palestinian society for generations and generations, that the masses have to constitute sort of a hospitable environment for the resistance, right? That they have to take an active role in enabling the broader resistance to sort of melt into broader society, right? In many ways, like quite literally. For example, the adoption of the kafia during the 1936 to 39 Great Revolt. And I saw that as in many ways complementary to this famous line by Mao that the guerrillas are like fish and that the people, right, the masses are the waters in which the fish swim. It's certainly a very compelling image, right? And it is a pretty unmistakable guide for the guerrillas themselves in terms of how to interact with the masses. But the thing is that it leaves the masses themselves on its own in something of a passive role. And so I thought the popular cradle kind of neatly complemented this, right? It's sort of articulates what the duties of the masses are in terms of supporting the resistance. In terms of the idea of Gaza as a liberated territory, I'll just directly quote from this passage of Mao on guerrilla warfare. Regarding the Japanese invasion, he said that some part of our country, or indeed most of it, may be captured by the enemy and become his rear area. It is our task to develop intensive guerrilla warfare over this vast area and convert the enemy's rear into an additional front. Thus, the enemy will never be able to stop fighting. And I think, what we've seen in Gaza since October 7th has really followed this principle to a T. Whether directly drawing from Mao or not, like this is essentially precisely the topic that the resistance has adopted. It realizes that because of the geographical limitations of the Strip, because it's surrounded on all sides, either by the sea or by the Zionist entity or, its collaborators in Egypt, it has no actual lateral or spatial strategic depth to work with. And so what they've done over the years is build this extensive tunnel network and use that as a sort of vertical strategic depth from which to continue waging guerrilla warfare really everywhere where the Israeli forces claim to have achieved full operational control above ground. Even in the large swaths of Gaza, where they have completely destroyed the physical infrastructure and essentially made it unlivable for the civilian population, the resistance remains active. From the north to the south, everywhere from Gaza City to Khan Yunis to Rafah. And indeed, as we saw recently, it has actually forced Israel to withdraw almost all of its ground forces from Gaza itself. And this, of course, has been extremely impressive, but it's also been probably the best illustration in recent times of this particular principle of guerrilla warfare articulated by Mao. And then finally, as concerns the axis of resistance, I think your listeners will probably be pretty familiar with what's going on the ground. But I guess what I just wanted to point to is that it constitutes basically another way that the resistance within Gaza overcomes its lack of strategic depth. It is, in a very physical sense, encircled by its enemy. But what these formations like Hezbollah, like the Islamic resistance in Iraq, like Ansar Allah in Yemen, and of course, the big one, Iran, right? What they essentially allow for is a counter-encirclement of the Zionist entity and of the regional outposts of its main backer, the U.S., right? All of these bases that it has in Iraq. A counter-encirclement by allies of the Palestinian resistance. And there's this very evocative passage from Mao's work on protracted war that was very reminiscent of this, right? If you allow me to quote that as well, he's talking about sort of several iterative layers of encirclement and counter-encirclement in the context of the great anti-fascist war that was unfolding in 1938. And he said, if the game of Weiqi, that is to say go, right, is extended to include the world, there's a third form of encirclement between us and the enemy, namely the interrelation between the front of aggression and the front of peace. The enemy encircles China, the Soviet Union, France, and Czechoslovakia with his front of aggression, while we counter-encircle Germany, Japan, and Italy with our front of peace. If you think about how China in 1938 was arguably the epicenter of the world anti-fascist struggle, I think that Gaza occupies that position today, and that we know very much what the front of aggression is. The front of peace is precisely the axis of resistance. And everything that's been able to accomplish in terms of forcing Israel to divert a large chunk of its military reserves to defend its northern front, in terms of imposing a punishing economic blockade on maritime trade bound to Israel, and just in general exhausting its resources and forcing it to spread them even more thin than it would be if they were just concentrated in Gaza, is putting this principle into effect. And what's really important is that what undergirds it is the continued viability of the Islamic Republic of Iran in terms of not dictating strategy to its allies, but providing a lot of the technical know-how for free, right? So that they can reproduce it themselves, so that they can produce their own weapons based on Iranian designs. And what in turn enables Iran to do that, even under this crushing US sanctions regime, is more than anything else, the extent of its bilateral trade with China. So that's something that we very much have to keep in mind. Again, when we're talking about the importance of developing a broader anti-imperialist politic that understands where all of these larger states stand in relation to the Palestinian struggle in Gaza.
Charles, I could have asked you there, why does the West fear solidarity? Why do capitalists fear solidarity? I think you just gave an excellent answer to that question as well, because not only, of course, material support, logistical support, but this ideological adoption or sharing of ideas, this taking of Mao's mass line, and then mixing that with political Islam or Islamic beliefs, Islamic practices to create a new interpretation of perhaps an idea that existed before, and providing vitality to a resistance movement, which is encircled, but is also, as you mentioned, the cradle of resistance, the cradle of the axis of resistance as well. So I thought that was an excellent answer. Getting to the final section of your article, and people, we've touched on, of course, major points of the article, but there's so much that we did not cover because we'd end up speaking for hours in regards to the topic. Definitely check out and read the full article after you listen to our discussion here. So, Charles, last question. In the final section of the article, you note that the Palestinian struggle helped forge the socialist Pan-Asianism, uniting liberatory forces from two nations at the other end of Mao's great continent that had once been locked in bitter colonial war. Could you walk us through kind of briefly what you meant here?
I guess as sort of like personal background to this section, part of the inspiration for what became this article came out of a reading group that was run by some comrades of mine in PYM, the Palestinian Youth Movement. It was about, I think this was the one about Ghassan Kanafani's work on the Great Palestinian Revolution, right, of 1936 to 39. But in the course of that, we touched on a bunch of other topics. And in particular, my comrade Yara Shofani of PYM pointed me to the fascinating historical episode that is the Japanese Red Army. Just to give a little bit of background on them, the Japanese Red Army, the JRA, was one of many, many armed formations that emerged from the Japanese New Left in the 60s, which all shared strong commitments to armed struggle and anti-imperialist resistance. Their sort of primary target was world imperialism, which they understood as being led by the United States. And, domestically in the Japanese context, they understood it was U.S. imperialism more than anything else. that had re-empowered and elevated once again to positions of high authority large swaths of the fascist and militarist leadership that had caused so much devastation to all of East Asia in World War II. Essentially, what U.S. imperialism was doing in Japan, they realized, was to take over from Japan as the primary imperial power in East Asia and turn Japan itself into not necessarily like the leading agent, but the rear base for U.S. imperial aggression against countries like Korea, China, and Vietnam. But these different formations had like a really wide variety of tactics and of strategies for how to respond to this, right? What really distinguished the JRA was that they came to the conclusion that their most viable response to this conjuncture was in fact not to wage the armed struggle within Japan itself, but to relocate themselves physically to a base of world revolution elsewhere. And sort of looking at the historical conjuncture of the time, they settled on Palestine as the contemporary liberation struggle where they could make the greatest impact. And so under the leadership of Fusako Shigenobu, they physically relocated from Japan to the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and essentially operated as a de facto foreign legion of the PFLP. Yeah, so they came to the attention of the world, right? The infamy of the West, and certainly became heroes to much of the Arab world by leading the Lod Airport operation in 1971. This unfortunately led to the assassination of Ghassan Kanafani, or at least it was the pretext used by Israel to justify the assassination of him and his niece. But nonetheless, the fact that 3 Japanese people mounted this operation in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle made a humongous impression. Coming out of that period as well was a very interesting piece of media. It's a documentary called Sekigun PFLP, or Red Army PFLP, Declaration of World War. Yeah, Yara, my comrade in PYM, basically introduced me through this reading group to that documentary. I watched it in full. This was probably like 3 years ago at least. And I was very moved, certainly by a lot of the documentary, but especially by this one particular musical interlude, which showed basically Palestinian guerrilla fighters engaged in sort of everyday tasks of political education and sort of arms training and so on, but set to all 3 verses of the Internationale in Chinese. And I was reflecting on, how this illustrated the centrality of the Chinese Revolution to this group of anti-imperialist militants from Japan, right? A country that at that point, was just barely 2 decades out from having waged this absolutely vicious colonial war against China. And so that got the gears turning a little bit. And, I did a bit more research on the JRA. And, particularly after October 7th, I was again reminded of this. I rewatched the documentary, and I kind of asked myself the question of, I wonder if there was like a Chinese equivalent to them. There is like a very intriguing aside in that article by Lillian Harris that I mentioned earlier, where she basically suggests that on one occasion, a number of Chinese youths, right, in 1971 or 72, had offered to go and fight for the PLO. They had gone to the PLO embassy in Beijing and made this offer. Apparently, there's no evidence that it was ever accepted or that there were, actual Chinese fighters in the ranks, in Palestine or in Lebanon. But it was sort of clear that a lot of the motivation was there. And I was thinking more about the sort of domestic milieu of the time in the Cultural Revolution. And then I remembered having come across a translation, interestingly, actually, of an elegy for Osama bin Laden that was written by a figure called Zhang Chengzhi, who I had remembered reading that he had been a Red Guard, right? He was a committed Maoist, and then he later converted to Islam and came to understand, and had come to understand world Islam, right, as like a pole of resistance to global imperialism. And so I was like, okay, this guy must have had interesting things to say about Palestine. And lo and behold, he absolutely did. His biography itself is very interesting. Like I said, not just a Red Guard, but the very first Red Guard of the Cultural Revolution, right? The first of millions and millions of these rebel youths in this movement that basically swept across the country in the first several years of that period. He really held on to that spirit, right? The Red Guard spirit, as he called it, at a time when official historiography and especially sort of elite narratives in the intelligentsia wrote off the Cultural Revolution in its entirety as 10 years of chaos, which is still the official narrative, right? So in that sense, he kind of like dissents from the official line, in that regard, but it's coming from a place of continued commitment to communism, right? To internationalism. And it wound up actually for him being very compatible with Islam when he converted actually to the Jafia order of Sufi Islam in 1987. So really, his basis for solidarity with the Palestinian cause lasted for decades and decades, and was only strengthened by these political evolutions that he underwent. I quote in my article a number of very moving articles that he wrote about previous Israeli assaults on Gaza in 2009 and 2014, which could pretty much apply directly to the current situation. But then what really intrigued me was that this guy Zhang Chengzhi also had spent a lot of time in Japan and had come into contact with many veterans of the armed struggle there. And so he did a lot of research sort of synthesizing everything that he found out about, particularly the Japanese Red Army, about all of the work that they did in direct material armed solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. There's one specific passage from this article that pretty much articulated exactly all these inchoate feelings that I had coming out of watching that documentary. He wrote that facing the sinister history of Japan's 150-year history of enslaving its neighbors in Asia, only the Arab-Japanese Red Army went against the grain and rebelled, defying Japan's colonial project of leaving Asia to join Europe. As the name suggests, the Arab-Japanese Red Army was a group of sons and daughters of Japan who threw themselves into the Arab world, that is, into the embrace of Mother Asia. And so for me, that kind of like brought full circle, this intellectual through line that started with the Pan-Asianism that Mao articulated, this idea of Palestine representing the gate of the great continent of Asia, with China as the rear, and with both of them playing crucial roles in the project of world liberation, but specifically of Pan-Asian liberation. And then I thought about this in relation as well to this article by Vijay Prashad that came out a couple of years ago entitled Is Asia Possible?, where he talks about the very tortured history of different ideas of Pan-Asianism, how Japan in particular during World War II with its so-called greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere really co-opted a lot of those ideas in service of its imperial project, how the Cold War continued to entrench these divides in a way that has made Pan-Asianism in particular as a project of regional liberation like so difficult to conceive of compared to Pan-Arabism, compared to Pan-Africanism, compared to Bolivarianism in the Americas. And then, it struck me, much as it struck Zhang Chengzhi, that, you have these two almost neighboring countries, right, China and Japan, with such a close neighboring history, and whose respective revolutionary lefts have been in dialogue of sorts, but where, in many ways, Palestine, at the other end of the continent, played such a crucial role in establishing the grounds for that solidarity in the 60s and 70s, and where within not just the anti-imperialist left of China and Japan and all these other Asian countries today, right, but also the broader Asian diaspora here in the United States, in the imperial core, Palestine today occupies that same role again. And this was articulated as well in this exchange that I had over email with Zhang Sheng, who is a Chinese scholar at Johns Hopkins, where he was talking about his political radicalization, his early education around the question of Palestine. I hadn't even known at the time that I uncovered, the article that he wrote about China and the JRA, that he had contact with these ideas from Zhang Chengzhi. But it turned out that this figure had played an extremely formative role for him as well. He wrote to me that, quote, this epic anthem of idealism with which the Chinese and Japanese leftists composed using their entire youth and life more than 50 years ago, for the first time played in front of me through Zhang Chengzhi's words, and largely shaped my nascent understanding of internationalism and Palestinian struggle for liberation in my early age. That intellectual influence, which in the person of Zhang Chengzhi, but many others as well, represents sort of a direct through line from the very overt revolutionary internationalism of the Mao period to this newer generation today, which whether, within the Chinese context or within the sort of progressive revolutionary socialist sectors of the Chinese and the Asian diaspora here, that's still such like a living through line and a history that I think is so important for us to recover, because essentially every people with some history of colonial oppression and some history of resistance against it can see in Palestine a reflection of that. And I think that in terms of really solidifying the movement that we see today, right, and in terms of truly giving it a global character that is properly historicized in terms of our own histories of liberation from national oppression, that the kind of process that I went through in terms of bringing this article into being, in terms of examining all these different facets of historical solidarity between China and the Palestinian struggle, right, and between Chinese people and the Palestinian struggle, is, it's an exercise that I think would be helpful for everyone. And if there's one thing that I hope this article inspires, it is for people to dig deeper into their own people's histories, right, in relation to that of the Palestinian people. And really, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of that.
Yeah, so Charles, I would say that you definitely succeeded in doing that and inspiring people to take a look back at not only China's solidarity with Palestine, but also, as you mentioned, looking at perhaps their own countries or their own nations or their own people groups' support for this resistance movement. Solidarity is, of course, the theme of this episode, and it's important for all of us listening who are socialists to understand the vital importance of it. As far as I understand, I could be wrong here, but I don't think there's been a resistance movement, a liberation movement that has succeeded without solidarity from without its own context of the struggle itself. So Charles, I just want to say thank you so much for joining this episode. Thanks so much for writing this article and leading us through this very important history.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Tony. It's been a pleasure.